How to conjugate Spanish AR verbs. Spanish infinitives consist of two parts, the verb stem and its ending. There are three categories of verbs, defined by the verb ending. You conjugate a verb differently depending on its category, that is, whether it ends in ar, or ir. To conjugate Spanish verbs ending in ar, you must remove the ending from the infinitive and replace it with another ending. Which ending you choose depends on the subject of the verb and the tense in which the action is taking place. For example, the first person past tense of the verb hablar, to speak, is hablo. So if you wanted to say I spoke to my mother in Spanish, you would say hablé con mi madre. Method 1. Forming the conjugated verb. 1. Isolate the verb stem. A Spanish infinitive is made up of two parts, the verb stem and the ending. For verbs with an AR ending, you simply subtract those two letters and you are left with the verb stem. For example, hablo is the verb stem of the infinitive hablar, the Spanish verb meaning to speak. 2. Watch out for stem, changing verbs. There are some verbs that change their stem when they are conjugated. When you're working with AR verbs, this includes verbs such as cerrar, meaning to close. The verbs in this group all change in the same way. When conjugated, the it changes to ie. For example, you would say yo cierro la puerta, or I close the door. There are another group of stem changers in the AR category of verbs, where the O changes to UE when you conjugate the verb. For example, when conjugating the verb contar, meaning to count or to tell, you would change the stem, such as yo cuento hasta 10, I count to 10. The stem doesn't change if your subject is nosotros, we, or vosotros, you all. 3. Identify your subject. The ending you add to the verb stem depends on the subject pronoun you are using. The subject pronoun identifies who is doing the action of the verb. In Spanish, subject pronouns will be either singular or plural, and either masculine or feminine. In Spanish, there are a total 9 subject pronouns. The singular subject pronouns are yo, I, tu, informal or familiar you, él, he, ella, she, and usted, formal you. The Spanish plural subject pronouns are nosotros, nosotras, masculine, feminine we, vosotros, vosotras, masculine, feminine informal you all, used in Spain, ellos, ellas, masculine, feminine they, and ustedes, formal you all, the only form used in Latin America. If you were talking about a mixed gender group, you use the masculine form. For example, if when you say we you mean a male and female couple, you would say nosotros. 4. Form the conjugated verb. Once you've found the correct verb stem and identified the subject of the sentence, all you have to do to conjugate a regular verb ending in ar is find the correct verb ending that matches up with your subject pronoun for the tense you need to use. You'll use the same endings for all regular verbs, even if the verb stem changes. Each verb ending changes depending on the subject pronoun. Keep in mind that in Spanish, you typically just use the conjugated verb in speech or writing, without actually saying or writing the subject pronoun. Your listener or reader will understand the subject pronoun because of the form of the verb you used. Method 2. Using the correct tense. 1. Choose present tense for actions happening now. The present tense typically is the first tense you'll learn if you're learning Spanish as a new language. In Spanish, the present tense also is used in several different contexts that may seem unnatural to you at first, particularly if your first language is English. For AR verbs, the present tense endings are o, as, a, amos, ice, and n. For the verb hablar, to speak, present tense conjugation would be yo hablo, I speak, tú hablas, you speak, usted, él, ella habla, you, he, she speaks, nosotros hablamos, we speak, vosotros habláis, you all speak. This form is used only in Spain, and ustedes, ellos hablan, you all, they speak. The regular present tense, technically referred to as the present indicative, also is used in Spanish to talk about habitual actions or ongoing events, where you typically would use the present progressive tense. For example, if a friend called and asked what you were doing, and you were cleaning the kitchen, you would say in English, I am cleaning the kitchen. But in Spanish, you would say limpio la cocina, literally I clean the kitchen. Present tense also is used for hypothetical situations, where in English you typically would use either the future tense or the present progressive. For example, if you were at a party and heard someone you dislike might be attending, you might say in English, if John shows up, I will leave, or if John shows up, I am leaving. But in Spanish, you would say si liga Juan, salgo, literally if Juan arrives, I leave. 2. Speak in future tense about things that will happen. There are two ways to talk about something happening in the future in Spanish. The simple future tense that requires you to conjugate the verb is used when you are saying that something will happen in the future, or to indicate that something might or may happen in the future. Keep in mind that the future tense in Spanish is not a combination of two verbs, as it is in English. The endings you add to the verb stem for future tense are the same for all three categories of Spanish verbs, as, amos, es, and on. For the verb hablar, to speak, the future tense conjugation would be yo hablo, I will speak, tú hablas, you will speak, usted, ella habla, you, he, she will speak, nosotros hablamos, we will speak, vosotros habláis, you all will speak, and ustedes, ellos hablan, you all, they will speak. 3. Conjugate the verb in past tense if the action has already happened. In Spanish, the past or preterite tense is used when an action was completed at some definite point in the past. If the action is ongoing, or has no specific ending or beginning, you wouldn't speak of it in the past tense. To conjugate verbs in past tense, you add asked, amos, astius, or eran to the verb stem, depending on the subject pronoun. For example, you would conjugate the verb hablar, to speak, as yo hablo, I spoke, tú hablaste, you spoke, usted, ella habló, you, he, she spoke, nosotros hablamos, we spoke, vosotros hablasteis, you all spoke, or ustedes, ellos hablaron, you all, they spoke. 4. Learn other verb tenses for specific situations. Apart from the basic indicative tenses, which you probably will use most often, Spanish has perfect and conditional tenses, just as English does. These tenses are used in specific contexts, which may differ from the way you would use them in English. Spanish indicative tenses are much more versatile than the same tenses in English. If you're just beginning to learn Spanish, stick to the three main tenses at first. Most of the time, a Spanish speaker will understand what you're saying and what you mean if you stick to the indicative present, past, and future tenses. Method 3. Conjugating irregular verbs. 1. Identify irregular verbs ending in -ar. Irregular verbs are those that don't use the standard, regular rules for conjugation. While fewer than 5% of verbs ending in -ar are irregular, many of those irregular verbs are ones you'll need to use often. Unfortunately, there's no blanket rule that you can use to conjugate irregular verbs, although you may notice patterns or commonalities among some of them. For the most part, conjugation of irregular verbs is simply a matter of memorizing them. One way to start is by searching online for a list of irregular verbs. Reading through the list a few times can give you a basic familiarity. You also can identify irregular verbs by spending a lot of time reading Spanish language websites or magazines, watching Spanish language movies or television programs, or talking to native speakers. 2. Practice conjugating estar. The verb estar, meaning to be, is probably one of the first Spanish verbs you'll learn, and it also happens to be irregular. While the endings are different, the conjugated verb is formed the same as regular verbs, by adding the ending to the verb stem est. The conjugation of estar is present tense is yo estoy, I am, tú estás, you are, usted, ella está, you, he, she is, nosotros estamos, we are, vosotros estáis, you all are, and ustedes, ellos están, you all, they are. Estar is not irregular when conjugating it in future tense. You use the same endings as you do for regular ar verbs. The preterite or past tense conjugation of estar is yo estuve, I was, tú estuviste, you were, usted, ella estuvo, you, he, she was, nosotros estuvimos, we were, vosotros estuvisteis, you all were, and ustedes, ellos estuvieron, you all, they were. 3. Learn how to conjugate dar. The Spanish verb dar, meaning to give or to have, is another irregular verb that you probably will use quite often even as a beginning speaker of Spanish. It is conjugated in the same way as the irregular verb ir, which means to go. The present tense conjugation of dar is yo doy, I give, tú das, you give, usted, ella da, you, he, she gives, nosotros damos, we give, vosotros dais, you all give, and ustedes, ellos dan, you all, they give. Dar is not irregular in the future tense. Make the conjugated form the same way, and using the same endings, as you would for any regular ar verbs. Dar is one of the few verbs that is also irregular in past or preterite tense. Conjugate dar as yo di, I gave, tú dist, you gave, usted, ella dio, you, he, she gave, nosotros dimos, we gave, vosotros disteis, you all gave, and ustedes, ellos dieron, you all, they gave. Tips. Sometimes the endings for a verb are the same in different tenses. For example, the first person plural, we or nosotros, conjugated verb ending for ar verbs is the same in both past and present tense. In these situations, your listener or reader will understand what you mean by the context of the sentence. Keep in mind that learning a new language can be difficult and at times confusing. Try to greet the endeavor with an open mind, understanding that it will take a lot of practice to get it right.